First off, with humans, you're not allowed to do a traditional controlled scientific experiment where you subject one group to a known problem and then you subject the other group to a not known problem.
You give the rat a disease or something.
You can do it with animals, but you can't do it with humans. So ethically, you're not allowed to do that.
Understood.
So it doesn't exist. The bigger problem with nutritional studies, and like there was a very, very famous study that came out over 20 years ago that was called the sort of infamous China study, which basically posited that when the standard of living started to improve in China, they started consuming meat. And when they started consuming meat, they posited, or they showed, that things like modern Western diseases and cancer started to go up. And so there was this whole movement of veganism because of the China study.
Oh my gosh, of course, I remember this.
Yeah.
This is years old.
Yeah, this is over 20 years ago.
Yes.
The problem when you do those kind of studies is what they do is these are generally epidemiological studies where they look at groups of people and they try to kind of draw patterns. And the problem is it's very hard with humans to isolate the variables because a lot of variables are what are called collinear, where they're, when you start eating more meat, you also start eating more fries.
I understand.
You also start eating more processed food. You also start doing things that are probably not as healthy.
Related to the behaviors, it's like you start working out.
Yes.
But then maybe you also stopped smoking at the same time, and you started a health kick. You gave up soda.
That's called the healthy user bias. So that's actually the opposite of it, which is when they take someone and say, hey, we're going to take you off of the standard American diet and we're going to put you on a vegan diet. And what happens is when people start doing that, they start adopting other healthier habits. Right. And it's very hard to extract the different variables. And they try to extract known variables like, are they smoking? Are they not smoking? Are they exercising? Are they not exercising? But they can't quantify the amounts of these things. And they certainly can't quantify things like how much you're sleeping. Are you stressed? Are you not stressed? And there are a lot of variables that are impossible to measure. And so all of these studies have all of these other variables that are not necessarily causal, but they're actually correlated.
Right, I get it.
And so it's very hard to extract what is true and what isn't true. And so what's happened in the last 20, 30 years, there is a sort of a negative philosophy that's called Scientism. And what Scientism is basically an excessive over-reliance on pure science, and using the aspects of pure science to try to make your point and to try to sort of demonstrate to the other person that if it can't be proven with pure science, it must not be real. And that's just not like true in life. There's a ton of things in life that we can't measure, but it doesn't mean it's not real. We can't measure love, for example. It doesn't mean it's not real, right? And
can you give two examples that I think would be relatable, and you tell me if I'm getting this wrong?
Sure.
To just try to show exactly what you're talking about. So if I looked at things like seed oils.
Yes.
I sat next to a doctor recently at some conference. He's like, well, the data, it still hasn't bore out with regard to these things being bad for you. And when my wife was like, I don't get it. It's a seed, like sunflower oil.
Yep.
I was like, it's not that, honey. It's the processing.
It's how they're made.
Right. So then I made her watch a video. It's like bleached and burnt and boiled in chemicals.
Deodorized deodorized, and they extract it with hexane or butane, which is a petroleum derivative. And
Jay, how does that go into an organic product is question number one.
Yep.
But then my point, I guess, would be, so the data says it's fine. In fact, I've heard numerous scientists and MDs, PhDs and MDs are like, well, the data says it's okay. Same with artificial sweeteners. And Casey, I had Casey Means on Dr. Casey Means, a bit ago, and she's like, well, I don't know, Jill. I mean, for me, I don't want a man-made chemical in my body like aspartame. But the data doesn't show necessarily that it's bad for you. But common sense would dictate it's horrendous.
Well, there's a few things that these studies generally don't take into account. So the first thing, they don't take into account cumulative compounding effects. So they don't take into account if you eat these every single day for 5, 10 years, because we don't have a way to track that. And a lot of these studies, and then the other thing that people push back on and why the cumulative aspect is relevant is a lot of scientists will push back on the quantities in animal studies. So they'll say like, oh, you're feeding animals 100 times what you would feed a human. And there are plenty of studies, by the way, that show seed oils are bad. There's also plenty of studies that show that they're fine. And so what a lot of the hardcore scientism people will rely on is that it's not conclusive. They're not denying that they're, like in the case of food dyes, which is obviously one of the things that I've picked on, it's not overwhelmingly conclusive. And what they cite is that they'll use cigarettes as like the gold standard of conclusiveness. And in food, there's literally nothing that has that level of conclusiveness as like what cigarettes have done over 20, 30 years.
Really, even if we get into things like glyphosate or...
Yeah. No, I mean, because like, again, there's plenty of people that are paid...
Forever chemicals.
The glyphosate example, there's plenty of people that are paid for by Monsanto that will say that glyphosate in very small doses doesn't affect humans.
Oh, very small doses. So dose-dependent conversation.
Yeah, but then it doesn't take into account
in 1970.
the cumulative effects, and it doesn't take into account how those cumulative effects begin to affect the body over time.
Okay.
And things like cancer do not come out of nowhere. It's not like you have a little bit of glyphosate and you have cancer the next day. These are all cumulative biological processes that take a lot of time to show up in terms of cellular damage, DNA damage, inflammation. And then the other thing that's really, really hard to do with human studies is there's so many that interact with each other, right?
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, comment, subscribe, and share. And make sure to let me know what guests you want to see on in the future.